What exactly is the gut microbiome? And maybe that's not a simple question. And describe kind of its function in our health.
It is a complex question, but in general, it's the microbiome constituents of our gut. They're part of us, I would consider. And they're bacteria, of course, but we're also learning there's a lot of different other organisms, including viruses and worms or helminths.
Welcome back to Longevity Roadmap. This is Buck Joffrey, and today I'm going to do an interesting interview with a couple guys in the gut space, a couple scientists. Now, the gut is such a hot topic when it comes to longevity these days. I mean, it would seem, that the healthy gut is really the answer to everything, like even world peace. But seriously, leaky gut syndrome, gut-brain axis, microbiome. You hear about probiotics, prebiotics, postbiotics. I mean, you hear these terms all the time in this space. And the problem I'm finding, guys, is that we actually know a lot less than you would think we do from all of the, Instagram posts, from the so-called, functional doctors. Nothing against them, but I mean, what does it even mean, by the way, to be a functional doctor? Does it mean that everyone else is dysfunctional? Anyway, listen, I am all for looking at medicine in different ways. And I do believe that, the traditional ways that we have approached everything are not necessarily the best ways. It's very defensive, and we're not looking to see, what kinds of things are out there, what we're not thinking about. But I gotta tell you, it's really important not to skip the rigorous evidence behind anything that you do to your body. And I should say that I'm also not denying that the gut probably, and almost certainly, I would say, has a huge role in overall health and wellness, probably a lot more than most people can ever imagine. But that's just the problem. What we know in this field is very little. And it's really in its infancy. And of course, that doesn't mean we know nothing. There's certainly some scientifically backed information out there that we can start implementing into our lives. But I would urge you to try to stay focused on evidence-based stuff, because again, remember, the longevity space is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And it's really easy to sell you pills. It's really easy to sell you supplements. In fact, in the influencer world, the way it works is that you talk about how big pharma is terrible, traditional doctors are terrible, and then you go sell your own line of supplements in the background that have no evidence to them. That's not what I'm suggesting is going on, across the board with GI stuff, with gut stuff. But it is an area, because there's very little information on there, it does become an area where that is increasingly possible. But anyway, that's why we're doing this interview. We got a couple of guys who are pretty hardcore scientists focused just on the gut and the microbiome. They're from the University of Illinois, and we'll have them right after these messages. Welcome back to Longevity Roadmap. I'm your host, Buck Joffrey. As usual, today we are diving into sort of a fascinating world that I don't quite understand. It's the gut health, and it's how it connects to our overall well-being. And so I'm thrilled to have two experts from the University of Illinois joining us today. First, we have Dr. Michael Miller. He's a professor of food microbiology. He's known as a specialist in gut microbiota, probiotics, food safety, with a particular focus on fermented dairy products. And also we have Dr. Jacob Matthew Allen, an assistant professor whose work bridges the gap between exercise science and microbiology. Dr. Allen's research delves into more sort of how exercise, stress, and nutrition influence our gut microbiota and immune system interactions. Welcome, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Thanks for having us. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a number of questions, and I guess I'll kind of let you guys decide who wants to field them. The first one is going to be really basic, and my audience is used to getting into the weeds, but I think it's important anyway to start relatively basic, because sometimes people think they know what things are, but they aren't. So let's start with a simple question. I mean, what exactly is the gut microbiome? And maybe that's not a simple question. And describe kind of its function in our health.
It is a complex question, but in general, it's the microbiome constituents of our gut. They're part of us, I would consider. And they're bacteria, of course, but we're also learning there's a lot of different other organisms, including viruses and worms or helminths. There's some fungi in our gut. Those are also part of the microbiome. But there are trillions of these microbes, and they are mostly found in the distal bowel, so the colon. That's where the densest population is. We also find them in the oral cavity, so in your mouth. We find them in the stomach. We find them in the small intestine. And beyond the gut, we also find them in other places of the body too, so even the skin. And there's some debate, but other tissues as well, including whether or not there's microbiomes of the liver and other tissues, but that's more up for debate. But most of the bacteria we find in the distal gut. And why we think they're important is, and why we're learning that they probably are, is that they produce a lot of bioactive compounds, metabolites, but also signaling proteins and peptides that impact our health. And particularly with my lab, we're focused in on the immune system, but also metabolic health, central nervous system health, or brain health, and other physiological systems of our body. So that's kind of why we're interested in these microbes. There's trillions of them. They interact together, but they also interact with us. And so that's kind of the broad overview of what the microbiome is.
Is the microbiome dynamic or fixed? I mean, I know there's a lot of discussion about microbiome these days, just in general health conversations. And maybe this goes into sort of the role of probiotics, prebiotics, postbiotics, all the different biotics that we talk about. But could you give us a sense for, like how much can we actually influence the microbiome?
Short answer is a lot. I mean, your genetics is part of it. Your exposure to things is part of it, but certainly your diet is another major flair. Yeah, so you have a lot of agency in that front.
So when you're talking about, I want to drill down on that question, because the obvious thing is, okay, well, I'm going to add a bunch of quote unquote favorable microorganisms to my gut. So I'm going to take a bunch of probiotics. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, but even like how much fiber you eat, what types of fiber you eat, what fermented foods you eat that have live cultures, these are all can be impacting the community that you have.
And then how much do you think in terms of from say like one culture to another, is there differences in microbiome?
Oh, people have done that kind of thing. So like you mean from vegetarians versus meat eaters, or people from the U.S. versus people from Africa who eat a different, less refined diet, for example.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to figure out from you is, like, okay, yeah, you can influence this stuff, but like, are there certain behaviors in certain cultures that we're finding, create a more favorable microbiota than others?
I think that Mike hit the dominant one, which is fiber intake. That's clearly probably the most prominent regulator. So, and we know in Western diets, fiber is lacking considerably. So for the viewers, fiber is any carbohydrate, which is a type of macromolecule that we can't digest normally, but the microbes can. So this fiber will get down to our microbes, usually in the distal bowel, and then those microbes have the enzymes that are able to degrade this fiber. And this would be a fermentable fiber. Not all fiber is fermentable, but that's one of the major constituents of the diet that we are growing to realize that Western societies are lacking considerably. And it is a major shaper of the microbiome because that is their food. As you can imagine, if you pull a food source, those microbes are going to disappear. And that's what many think that is one of the major issues with our westernized microbiome is this lack of fiber. And the other thing is that not all fibers are the same. So there are a wide variety of fiber types. And depending on what types of whole foods you eat, you can get all sorts of different types of fiber. And so I would consider that probably one of the most important components, if not the most important, about shaping the entire microbial landscape.
So just how would you, just from a practical standpoint, could you break that down a little bit? Like you said, some fibers are more important, more impactful, more beneficial.
Well, I'm gonna refrain from saying more or less beneficial because this is still an active area of research. So, like, there's a type of fiber called an inulin. Inulin is a fiber, and that is a pretty simple fiber. Actually, it's just a bunch of sugars lined up in a linear chain, and they're fructose sugars. They're pretty simple, but they're gonna really promote bacteria that like to eat inulin. In this case, fructose, the sugars of that inulin, which could be good, could be bad, but a lot of the stuff we're seeing is probably inulin fiber is good under most cases, but it depends on the person and depends on their microbiome. And then there's other fibers like pectin. Pectin you find in like apple skins, for example. Mike could probably name some more foods that
Orange pulp.
Yeah, orange pulp. A lot of fruit skins have pectin. It's a much more complex fiber. Complex in that there's a bunch of branching in it, so a bunch of branches and a bunch of different types of sugars which the microbes eat. And so if you feed somebody pectin versus you feed somebody inulin, they're both fibers, they're both fermentable fibers, but they're going to be doing different things to the microbiome.
How do we know, like, I guess just from a practical standpoint, like if somebody's listening to this, well, that's good to know, like, which one do, what do I want? What should I do then?
I think for a typical American is that they're just not eating enough. So I think we can eat more. And if you get to the point where you're eating enough, then if you want to optimize which subcategory you're eating, like if you have high cholesterol and you want more, soluble oat fiber and kind of go that route, you can do that. But I think these are all, their impact on the microbiome is one aspect, but they're also important for satiety, laxation, lots of other features that they could also contribute to your microbial community too. Just transit time changes how much time the microbes have to do stuff, and so it's a complicated. The key is though, if you're eating a varied diet with lots of different fibers there, I think that's always until we know something else, that's always the best approach, and not eating just 30 grams of inulin every day and no other fiber. That would be like, if you want to have massive gas, you could go for that route or something. But or lose, spend some time in the bathroom, maybe.
Your viewers will find out quickly if you just take an inulin supplement, it's a gas promoting fiber. So that is a common side effect of taking inulin, which is that.
If you take a reasonable amount, it's not that you might not notice, but if you ate try to fulfill your fiber requirement with just inulin, I would suspect you would have, you would enter trouble town.
Yeah. A lot of people are doing this carnivore diet now, which, to me, I would be very wary of it. I mean, I think, ketogenic diets are great and stuff, but do you have any thoughts on that? Because I mean, it's sort of hard to get. Do you get any? I mean, would you get any fiber from?
I'm not a fan.
No.
Yeah. Well, not that protein is bad, but, we'll talk about maybe some protein derivatives, but not all protein that gets to the gut. And in fact, a lot of it does to the distal gut, what the microbes can metabolize. They can also ferment protein. Some of those products are good. Some of those products, not so good. And so I think that people should be very careful, in my personal opinion, about going on these fad diets that are this extreme. And so I'll leave it there.
You've used the word, just so everybody understands what it means, fermentation in general, maybe just a quick definition of that, and then go into how do fermented foods like yogurt and cheese affect our gut health?
Okay, so that's a challenging one because we give different definitions depending on the application we're using. But I think for our purposes today, we could just define fermentation as desirable microbial metabolism. So it is the act of microbes on substrates and metabolizing it to something that we want. Sometimes we say in the absence of oxygen, for example, in the gut, that would be appropriate. But if we use fermentation in some food context, some of those are aerobic, which is with oxygen, and then fermentation doesn't make sense with that definition, even though we still use it. That's why it's complicated. But I think for us, microbial metabolism on our materials.
So how do fermented foods like yogurt and cheese, these things that are basically, created by, how do they affect your gut health?
Complicated, I guess. But I mean, yogurt has, let's start with yogurt. That's easier. That has a large, very healthy active cultures in it. When you, by rule in the U.S., all yogurt is made with live cultures. And when you buy it, there's typically 10 to 8 or more live cultures per serving in that yogurt. So you're eating a lot of live bacteria every time you eat yogurt. These bacteria can contribute various benefits. Turns out that many yogurts actually have more lactose in it than milk does, actually, because there's some concentration that happens when you make yogurt. And but even though you have lactose, there are many lactose intolerant people can eat yogurt because they're eating these bacteria that also are good at digesting lactose and have the enzymes to do it. So you're kind of getting a supplement while you're eating the product. Just as like one benefit. There's a lot of evidence that yogurt is health promoting and it's could be part of a healthy diet. And there's always more. The dairy industry is always supporting studies on that front. Cheese is another fun one. Cheese has live cultures as well, but it's not as high and it's a little different scenario. It's not normally the cultures you start with. These are the cultures that kind of arise during ripening. And so you can, cheese makers, I don't know if you've seen this over the years, but there's been a few probiotic cheeses over the years where they select cultures for ripening that they know have some kind of probiotic activity and they kind of can do that. I can let Jacob kind of answer whether just the general healthiness of eating cheese and yogurt. But I think I did the microbial part. But
yogurt's a little bit more standardized, I guess, at least in the U.S., because there's 2 starter cultures that are used virtually for every yogurt. Starter cultures are the type of bacteria. Lactobacillus bulgaricus and Streptococcus thermophilus are used in almost every bacteria or every yogurt starter. Whereas cheese, there's so many different cheeses with different bacteria on the cheese. And they're different than what we find in yogurt. And Mike knows more about the cheese bacteria than I do, but they're super diverse and a lot different than what we see in yogurt.
Cheese is also more concentrated. So like it takes 10 gallons of milk to make 10 pounds of milk to make 1 pound of cheese, whereas 10 pounds of milk makes 10 pounds of yogurt. Cheese is a concentration of the fat and the protein from milk. So if you eat too much, a lot of cheese, you're getting a lot of the milk fat that way, which, depending on how much you're talking about, could be a bad idea.
Talk a little bit about the concept of dietary bioactives and how they interact with our gut microbiome.
So I guess the definition of dietary bioactive would be any compound in a food that is bioactive against our cells. So, i.e., it interacts with a receptor or receptors, said compound that might be in yogurt, might be in cheese, might be in any other product. Doesn't need to be microbial derived necessarily, but then interacts with our receptors and causes some physiological response, good or bad. So,
in the gut necessarily?
It doesn't have to be the gut. And, what we know about some of the products that microbes produce, and we think is very important, is that they can get into our circulation. They can get into tissues beyond the gut. They can certainly signal to gut tissue, and that's of interest to our lab and Mike's lab too, but a lot of the metabolites that we're focused in on now, we know can get into the circulation after we consume them, get into the blood, and into other tissues as well. So it's the gut, but also we're thinking about this microbial signaling occurring across the gut and beyond to other tissues as well. So that's kind of my broad strokes idea of what a bioactive is.
Yeah. So how about an example?
Let me give you some examples, like some ways to think about it. Bioactives can come in lots of forms. Some are in the food to begin with, and they're part of the diet. Others, the bacteria convert to take something that's in the diet and convert to something that's more bioactive. Others, the bacteria convert it to a less bioactive form, depending on. So there's all these competing fluxes happening, and it depends on which bioactive you're talking about. But if you want to talk about like the anthocyanins in blueberries, the bitter compounds in Nebraska vegetables, which is one I study, there's lots of interesting dietary compounds that are have interesting activity on the host, but in some cases they're active. Some cases their activity goes up with fermentation in the gut. Some the fermentation takes their activity away. And sometimes it depends on it could be both. It depends on the person and their microbial community they have. If you get really crazy, and so which is an area that I like to get into. So it's a complicated question, but yeah, there's all the above happen.
So what's the significance of them, though? Why should we care about bioactives? Like, I mean, they're influential, but maybe there's an example you could give us where, some sort of process is happening and, we should be aware of, or...
Well, so I could give you the broccoli example, which is
Yeah.
the one I know best. But when you eat cooked broccoli versus raw broccoli, you've probably noticed that the flavor is quite different.
Better.
Raw broccoli is less stronger flavor, right? It's got a little more pungent, a little more bitter. And that bitterness is from a compound called sulforaphane. That's not actually present in the plant. It's present as a glucoraphanin. It's a glycoside. And they keep an enzyme in the glycoside separate in the plant tissue. And when you chew the plant, this enzyme and the glycoside come in contact, and the result is this bitter compound. So as you chew raw broccoli or raw kale, other brassica vegetables, you get this raw, this pungent flavor as you're chewing. As it sits there without chewing, it doesn't have this flavor. If you could somehow eat the broccoli without chewing, you wouldn't get that sensation. But the thought is this is so the plant, when insects or herbivores eat it, it's like to encourage them not to eat it. It turns out these bitter compounds are very bioactive, have a lot of health promoting properties that we're interested in. But if you cook the broccoli, that you inactivate the enzyme that can do it in the plant. So now when you chew it, you don't get the bitterness like you do with the raw broccoli. That compound then makes it to your colon where the gut bacteria can then activate it or not, depending on your community. And actually the spectrum of how much is converted to this bioactive form is quite varied. It could be like some studies see it's like 50% to 0.5%, depending on the person and their community, the microbial community they have. And so that's a pretty big range. Some people are getting a lot of the bioactivity from eating cooked broccoli, and some are getting almost none. And so, that says, well, that maybe for people who get less, maybe we should look at a probiotic approach that could maybe supplement that and help that be better. Maybe we would say, you should only eat raw broccoli, not cooked broccoli. But who have this better active community can eat either and get the same health benefit. So by understanding the variation between people and their community, you can give more tailored recommendations, tailored interventions for these kinds of approaches.
I mean, I know there is some commercially available things that will look at your flora. What are your thoughts on that? And like, do we really have a good idea of, how to optimize that? I mean, or is that just, one of these things in a multi-billion-dollar longevity space that people are just monetizing?
You want the honest answer?
Yeah.
I think a lot of them are BS.
Yeah.
Not to say that they don't have potential, but I think that the type of sequencing that is affordable for that type of thing, it's called 16S rRNA. It's a ribosomal sequencing. And it's when it comes to microbiology and understanding what they're doing, it's very high level. And so trying to do predictive type analysis, especially with diet, like how you're going to respond to this diet from a 16S based approach, is a guesstimation at best, I would say. And this is me opining based off of there's the type of detail of what we need to know about these bacteria in our gut. It takes a lot more and currently more expensive approaches. Now, that doesn't mean it's not possible in the future to move towards this. And I'm not necessarily, denigrating the companies that are trying this, because I think there's some potential in the future and you have to, build up to that. But I do worry a little bit about these, companies saying we could predict how you respond to a dietary intervention by sequencing your microbiome, because I know the type of sequencing they're doing and it's not adequate, to put it bluntly. And so I think we have to be careful. But there are certainly, some people would argue we could use machine learning and a lot of these next generation AI tools to get some, a better understanding without going deeper with the sequencing. But I think we have to be a little bit careful because ultimately we need to bring it back to what these microbes are actually doing. And for that, we need to culture them and understand their biology. And sequencing is great, but we can't do everything with that.
Sure.
So that's
I would even add that we don't even know. I don't think there's like a consensus. This is a good community.
No. Yeah.
So
really, we don't have a good sense even of that, of like what's a good community.
No, I think we know, like, if you have this one or that one, that's not good. Like, we can recognize maybe that kind of, like, these are pathogens, that's not good. But I think what constitutes a good community, that's a little fuzzy. And it kind of depends. What's good for me might not be good for you. It's kind of good, it's hard to say what's a good community. I think until the definition of what a good community is more clear, then maybe that would enable predictions on how to get to what a good community would be, because then we know what the target is. Mm-hmm. So today, I think the target is, there's some association with this one with heart disease, some association with this one with reduced risk of colon cancer. There's like all these associations, and maybe you can kind of piece together some kind of conclusion with these barrage of associations that have been figured out. But of course, most of these associations don't have a mechanistic aspect to underpin it, so it's a little bit hand wavy. But I think that fundamentally the better understanding of what they're all doing and how they're contributing, and so what makes that a healthy community, that would enable this process to be even better. Because I think at that point we don't even agree on that part. I think is the founding starting problem.
Yeah, a good analogy. I don't think there is one healthy microbiome. I think that's pretty, in my opinion, pretty clear. There are clearly a lot of healthy people out there, and we know that those people have different microbiomes. And so to say that there's like one beautiful microbiome that we should all shoot for, I just don't think that exists. What Mike and I think the field is headed is not to ignore the composition or the microbes that are there, because that certainly matters. But what we are moving towards is understanding is what are they doing, and how are they impacting our health? And so we might have a group of microbes in one person that initiate, the production of some compounds that are healthy. And another person, we might have a different set of microbes that do the same thing.
Yeah.
And so, if we look at the output to function, it's the same thing, but we have different sets of microbes doing it. And that's one thing that, to be honest, the field is in its really early stage.
It sure sounds like it.
Yeah.
I'll say that much.
So,
let's talk. Let's shift a little bit about how it's affecting some of the body. Though, I mean, one of the things that comes up a lot is the role of the gut microbiome potentially playing in immune system function. So obviously, maybe if you want to start, obviously, kind of discuss the immune system is a lot of it is in the gut. If you want to start with that, and how does it play a role?
Yeah. So I'll start. There's a lot to cover. But immune system is very complicated. But you're correct. You're 100% correct. Most of the immune cells in the body are located in the gut, and there are a lot of different types of immune cells. We have what we call innate immune cells, which do kind of the quick, dirty functions of the immune system. They clear pathogens. They release inflammatory molecules. But we also have what we call the adaptive side of the immune system, like T cells and B cells. And there's also a ton of those in the gut as well. And there's a lot of theories of why we have such a prominent amount of our immune system in the gut. Again, about 60 to 70% estimated. But the likely explanation is that they're dealing with that high microbial load. And when I say dealing with, it's making sure that we don't have an overt immune response to our natural microbiome, right? So if we were responding to every microbe in our gut as if it were a pathogen, that would be
a problem.
Not so good.
Yeah.
And in fact, we think that might be what accidentally happens during certain diseases of the gut.
Really? Like inflammatory bowel disease, or?
Got it. That's 100% right. Yeah. And so And we don't know exactly how that happens. It's still an idiopathic disease. But yes, so there's what we call a tolerance aspect that has to occur with the immune system, i.e., the ability of the immune system to recognize that these bacteria and other microorganisms are there in the gut. We see you, but we're not going to initiate this massive inflammatory response because that would be problematic. And we also do that with food particles as well. And this concept of oral tolerance of food antigens too occurs, and that evolves the immune system in the intestine as well. So yeah, it's complicated. I hope that's a broad stroke overview. But we also know that, building on that is that not only the microbes in particular antigens that they present, but what we're interested in, I'll get to some of the work we're doing with fermented foods, is that they produce metabolites that interact with receptors on immune cells that shape how these immune cells respond to bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are trying to promote some of that, what we think is an anti-inflammatory activity with some of the metabolites we find in fermented foods, but are also within our gut as well.
Do you, I'm sure you're familiar with, people talk a lot about leaky gut syndrome. First of all, I guess, you want to describe it real quick and tell me what your thoughts are on this, because frankly, I actually, I'm asking you this in part because I'm a little confused whether how much of this is actually real science and how much is speculation, because, I've had people on the show talk about leaky gut syndrome like it's an absolute 100% real thing. And then I've literally had a gastroenterologist tell me that it was not something that is a proven entity. So maybe talk about, the concept first and then what your thoughts are.
I'll start and I'll let Mike, because I 100% it's a real thing. This happens. The bacteria, and so leaky gut is when bacteria that are normally in the lumen or within your gastrointestinal tract leak through, and we know for a fact that happens. And
like with obesity, for example.
Yeah, the obesity, there's some debate as to how extensive it is and how depending on the type of obesity. But it definitely happens for sure.
So I guess just for the audience, the idea here, correct me if I'm wrong, but you got all of these bacteria, the good ones, the bad ones, all these, but they're supposed to be in your gut. They're not supposed to enter this sterile bloodstream inside of, in that regard, the gut's still considered sort of the outside world. It's not part of our internal being, like our organs, our blood vessels, and all that. And what we're talking about here is potentially some kind of, gap or some kind of breakage in intestinal lining or something like that is allowing some of these bugs from the outside world to actually enter the bloodstream. And so the theory,
but also intact food proteins too. So intact, this is kind of connected to allergies perhaps too, but intact food proteins can get through leaky gut too.
Yeah. So
not
in
just
that regard,
bacteria products.
Yeah. So you're talking about basically things that aren't supposed to get into the bloodstream, getting into the bloodstream, and therefore creating an immune response because your body doesn't recognize them as something that's supposed to be there. And this might, people speculate, result in various autoimmune disorders or just general inflammation in general.
And that's where probably your gastroenterologist is coming in and saying we got to pump the brakes a little bit.
Yeah.
We don't know. We don't have a causative link yet between leaky gut and all of these diseases.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's probably where your previous guest was like, let's pump the brakes a little bit, because we know that this happens. It's a physiological response, but is it 100% what's initiating rheumatoid arthritis? We don't know that. And I think that's probably where
we can measure that, and we do measure in our animal models all the time.
Yes.
And what do you find? What do you find in the animal models?
Oh, that happens. You can trigger it with different disease states. You can improve it with different interventions or make it worse. I mean, it's definitely a real thing.
So you can trigger
relationship to like rheumatoid arthritis or things like that. That's maybe another conversation. But the fact that the gut can be, for some individuals, be more leaky than it is for other individuals, that is clear as day. I know that's true. because we can see that if we give animals colitis on purpose, their guts will be more leaky.
Can you create or reverse any kind of, immune reaction, systemic immune reaction, in the lab by manipulation of this?
We're working on it. We're working on it.
Yeah.
I think that's where a lot of focus is going. Leaky gut, but also tamping down some of the overt excessive immune responses.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something that I think a lot of people are working on, certainly that Mike and I are interested in. Going back to the leaky gut, one of the other parts of my lab, another line of research not related to fermented foods, is stress, psychological stress. And we know that we can induce leaky gut if we stress an animal enough. And so we can replicate that over and over again. And so there are certainly some brain to gut interactions as well that drive leaky gut.
And
we don't know exactly how this happens, but we have some ideas.
Will you say that there is a role of, I presume there is, but of the actual microbiota and whether or not the endothelial cells of the gut become leaky?
The microbiome has a role, but it's a communication. And so what is the chicken or the egg? What goes bad first? Our cells or their cells? That's a big question.
Yeah. That's kind of what the question is.
Yeah,
exactly. That's what I was asking. Right.
Yeah. So the epithelial cells, so these cells that line the intestine, they're not one cell type, but in general, they produce a lot of compounds and some other substances like a mucus that help keep under normal circumstances, help keep bacteria at bay. And so they produce antimicrobial compounds. They produce mucins, which produce the mucus layer that essentially keeps a guardrail on the bacteria. My lab is interested in what might lead to disruptions in those epithelial cells that would disrupt the production of those compounds.
Yeah, and you mentioned stress.
Yes,
as a trigger.
Yep.
And what do you think the mechanism there would be?
Well, that's a great question.
Yeah.
It's something we're trying to figure out. We have
like
some
cortisol levels, or
cortisol, and we think cortisol is important, but we also think an overlooked component is the adrenergic system. So catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine. We think glucocorticoids or cortisol is important, but we also think these catecholamines, or for the lay audience, adrenaline and noradrenaline.
So having more of a sympathetic nervous, so basically more of a fight or flight kind of, lean in your day-to-day nervous system as opposed to the rest and relax.
You got it. And we think it's complicated because we don't think it's the initial, with any stress response, the initial stress response is good, probably. And so we think that there's some initial, probably good things that happen in the gut. The problem is when you get chronic levels of these hormones. And so, again, saying the hormones are good or bad is tricky because what we think the problem occurs is when, again, and this is what we see with stress too, when you have chronicity of that stressful event that occurs over weeks or months, that's when we start to see the problems in the gut.
How about exercise? Things like cardio, strength training. How do they affect our gut bacteria?
You fit all his favorite topics.
Yeah, exactly. We think it's good. We think exercise is good for a lot of things, but certainly there's some evidence it's good for the microbiome too. We think
do you think, again, that basically we're talking about, if you exercise through decreasing stress, you're probably increasing your basal level of parasympathetic activity. You think it's probably similar to the idea of getting back into more of the rest and relax?
Yes, that is certainly a potential possibility. With exercise, there's so many things happening. It's so difficult to tease out a quote single mechanism of what it is. There's also some important called metabolic cross-feeding that probably happens with exercise. some metabolites that we produce might cross-feed to the microbes, is a certain hypothesis that we've thought about a little bit. Exercise is a difficult one to tease out, but in general, we think it's beneficial for the gut and particularly the microbiome. And in fact, in some of the work we did earlier, my PhD showed that exercise can promote levels of some beneficial metabolites called short-chain fatty acids. We think that is probably one of the potential benefits that it has on the gut as well.
One of the other things that you just briefly mentioned, which I think would be a good thing to talk about, is, people often talk about this gut-brain axis. What are they talking about, and is it real?
It's real, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mike, do you want to do it, or you want me?
No, it's you. This is all more your angle.
Yeah, it's certainly real.
Well, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated because there's and I'm trying to find a good place to start that would make a lot of sense. So I'll start with what we've already been talking about, which is microbes produce a lot of compounds. They get into our blood, and they can also get into the brain. I left off talking about short-chain fatty acids, which are the end products. We started this conversation with fiber. So when microbes degrade fiber, so if we eat some food with fiber in it, the microbes will degrade it. And most of the time they end up in these compounds called short-chain fatty acids. And there's 3 of them, but that's not important. But the point is they can get into the blood, and then they can get transported into the brain. And what we've learned through some of the work that we've done in our lab, but also across other labs too, is that these short-chain fatty acids can impact cells in the brain and impact their physiology. And we've been particularly focused on this cell type, I'm getting into the nitty-gritty now, called microglia, which are these supportive immune-like cells in the brain that contribute to a whole host of very important processes in the brain.
Yeah.
So that's one way.
Is there any epidemiologic data here in terms of say like Alzheimer's disease, and, issues with gut? I'm just curious if,
Yeah, I'm going to be careful here because I'm not an Alzheimer's disease expert.
Well, I'm not really asking you to be my background is sort of broad, right? I used to be a neurosurgery guy, and now I'm like focused on all sorts of longevity things. And so it makes me think, if you're talking about microglia in the brain, immediately the thought is, well, gosh, does that mean if your microglia are not healthy or they're not functioning properly, you're not clearing out aggregates from the brain and all that? So that's kind of where my thought process goes, and I just wonder if there's even some epidemiological or a large perspective thought on this. That's all.
Epidemiological, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But you're onto something that I think is very relevant. I certainly, and then again, I'm opining here, but I think that the microbiome could have a critical, and this has been shown, but especially during aging when Alzheimer's disease occurs, we have shown that microglia change during aging, and not so much for the better.
Yeah.
And that we know this for a fact, that if we add short-chain fatty acids directly to microglia, which are these microbial metabolites, we can change their physiology and make them more anti-inflammatory. So we published that back in 2019. The question is, linking the two, not only in mouse models, but in people. And that's where it gets a little bit trickier. Yeah. But if I had to hypothesize, I would follow along your thought process there and say, yes, we think that there's some microbial components that are important for shaping brain health during aging, and whether or not that carries over to Alzheimer's, I think, is a very interesting question, but one that hasn't been answered yet.
Are those fatty acids different from like omega-3s? The typical stuff, like, we've been people are talking a lot about right now the importance of, these kinds of fish oils and things like that for brain health, and so sort of similar thing, or is it, are these different?
Quite different. Yeah. And I'll let Mike jump in here too, but they're called short chains because they're shorter chains. So they're 2 carbon, 3 carbon, or 4 carbon in length. Omega-3 fatty acids and omega-6 fatty acids are much bigger, and they're different structures than these short chain fatty acids. And Mike can add on to that too.
Yeah.
Sure.
That's perfect. I think if we think about the gut-brain axis again, there's lots of, that's direct effects You actually have lots of endocrine cells in your gut as well that trigger, when they're triggered, they can impact satiety and other issues. And so there's lots of interactions there. The vagus nerve, I mean, a lot of interest in the vagus nerve and its interaction with the microbial, the community there and their metabolites and so forth. Lots of evidence for anxiety and some other issues like this and the impact of the microbiome on those. At least a lot of hypotheses and some data being generated on that front, at least associations. So I think it's, as people learn more and more about the gut microbiota, there's going to be more and more connections like that found. And so there'll just be more, more calls for more hypothesis generated mechanistic work to kind of make sure it's not just associations, actually causative and important.
Sure. Just a couple more sort of, I guess, more take-home type things for people. You've talked about ultimately, like, one of the big things people can do, to positively impact their microbiome is eating more fiber. So that's a good take-home. And in general, my guess is that you're saying that sort of, wide variety of fiber, probably not just like one kind of fiber. Like you mentioned, don't pound inulin or whatever. But
or Metamucil for that matter. You don't want to just get it off of Metamucil either. Right.
That's a good thing to know, because I think a lot of people do, just try to get, they take their one fiber, product. I mean, is there, I don't know if you not that you're plugging a product, but is there something, some kind of a specific type of product that you think would be useful if people want to make sure they get enough?
I think I would say that Metamucil is good, but I think what Mike is getting at is don't just drink Metamucil.
Yeah.
I would go back
just variety.
Whole food
foods and variety.
And you just can't replace what you get from whole vegetables and whole foods. And I'll add like another thing, if you can, for certain things, leave the skins on, like for potatoes, for instance. Potatoes are a great source of dietary fiber, especially in the skin. So there's what we call resistant starch in the skin of potatoes. Depending on how they're cooked, there could be a really, really great source of fiber. So things like that, too, that people don't normally think of, not necessarily, quote, a vegetable, but could have a high amount of dietary fiber. But if you peel the skin off the potato, most of the fiber is not there.
What is your take on people taking over-the-counter probiotics? I guess if you're going to do that, how do you know which one to take? There's like 10 million different probiotics.
Yeah. So the beauty of that approach is that theoretically, any probiotic product I would buy, I get this question a lot, so I have a prepared answer.
Yeah.
Anyone I would look at, see the name of the organism that they're using, because they will indicate the strain name. It won't just say bifidus or something. It will say Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG or something like that. It will give you a strain designation. You can look that up on PubMed. You can look at the evidence, and you can decide for yourself if it's been associated with something that seems worthwhile for you or whatever. But as long as they indicate the strain name, you can then have a chance to look up. You can even look up the clinical trials through the website for that and look at what the data is supporting that particular strain for that particular outcomes that they've tested, and you can kind of see what the evidence and weigh it for yourself.
So you bring up an interesting point there, which I want to highlight, which is it's almost like you're looking at these probiotics and saying, that certain probiotics are supposed to do certain things. Like, for example, you mentioned maybe you wanted to, if you're trying to, lower your lipids, just as an example, not that there's a probiotic that does that necessarily, but these are outcome-based strains. Is that right?
Yeah, they'll do clinical trials where they test that strain for a defined purpose, and then they'll have evidence for whether it met the goal or not, and all, like any clinical trial, you can get all the information from it.
What are some examples of things that probiotics, some of the outcomes that people can, that are purported to happen from various strains?
The best one that is the one that's the most obvious. I think this is the most brilliant one is the Activia, the bifidobacterium Activia yogurt. That was an unbelievable, thoughtful idea. They had a strain that they knew promoted regularity. So the people that were constipated, they kind of
Wow.
move things along a little faster. And the beauty of that effect is that people that are constipated, they recognize it, and then they notice that they feel different when they eat the product. And so it's an amazing strategy of finding a health benefit that is, you don't need a doctor to do a blood test to test, or you to take it for a year to see if your some issue went down or not.
Yeah.
Or it's a very, because a lot of the ones that have some strong evidence are like, you're less likely to get ill this year. Like over the course of a year, you might get only 2 colds instead of 3.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
That's hard.
how do you know that worked or didn't work? Like on an individual basis, that's a little more difficult to confirm. But if you feel like, wow, I don't feel constipated anymore, you know that pretty easily. And so I think that's one of the, so people that suffer from something like that, I think that's a great product you can try. And if it works, you can keep eating it. If it doesn't work for you, then you stop, and no harm done. You just move on.
So
it's very
I
easy.
have a question, I guess, that just from my own personal experience, I actually don't seem to respond very well to probiotics from the standpoint, like if I take like a probiotic that's supposed to be really good, I end up not feeling good. Like my GI, it's a mess. So why would that happen? Or is it just me, or does this happen?
It could be. And
go
ahead, Mike.
Well, to me, it just demonstrates that they're doing something.
Yeah.
They're not just like, it's just not some kind of baloney that they just inert things you're eating and there's some kind of like hocus pocus that we're saying. They actually are alive. They're doing metabolism in your gut. They're doing stuff, interacting with you. And so they're not just inert passengers. They're doing things. And so it's conceivable that that could be desirable in some cases, not desirable in others, and depends on the individual and what their community is like. Yeah, that's totally.
Well, it definitely wasn't desirable.
So the other thing to always think about with probiotics, these are not pharmaceuticals. These are like complementary type things you're doing. These are not going to cure cancer or do things like this. These are things that can make you feel better after taking antibiotics and make your diarrhea less likely to get it after taking antibiotics. Like that's not.
Yeah. Well, there's some debate about that one. Because I'll put the probiotic negative spin because I think that there are some potential pullbacks we should do, because I don't think that we know enough about it to say that they're good. And in fact, there's some evidence that the post antibiotics, so a lot of people are, after you take an antibiotic, you should, consume all these probiotics. And in fact, there's some data to suggest that it might do the opposite. It actually might inhibit the natural recolonization of your microbiome. And so we got to be careful.
Yeah.
And what we throw probiotics at everything. And especially, I'll argue, go into the research and why we think our fermented food research is important. A capsule-based probiotic, I think there's some limitations there. Number one, shelf life of the bacteria in the capsule. When they are consumed, do they colonize? Oftentimes we find that they don't colonize. That doesn't mean that they're not active, but they don't necessarily colonize your gut. And number three, interactions with other microbes. So going back to why you respond potentially negatively to probiotics that you take, it could be because the endogenous microbes that you have in your gut there's some competition there, or your immune system isn't responding to them. And these are all things that we just don't know yet.
I don't know.
It's fair. So it's a great question, but I think in the probiotic field, much less so than the first thing we talked about, which was prebiotics, where there's a lot better data. Probiotic field is a lot messier.
Yeah.
If that's helpful.
Makes sense. So one last question
I add, doing the capsule versus in the food matrix is very important. There's a lot of effects that way. How the cells are grown before you even eat them. I mean, there's lots of like nuanced. And so when you look at the probiotic literature, you'll only find some studies find that this bacteria does something, and these other people find it did the opposite.
Yeah.
And you realize, well, the way they did the experiment, how they prepared the cells is different. It's a lot of nuance.
Yeah.
So
one last question I have for you. And, I think in many ways, one of the things that I got out of this from you guys that's very useful to know is that this whole leaky gut thing is for real. And there's a whole host of issues that come from that. Do you have any idea, any thoughts, practical opinion on what you can do to, decrease the permeability of your gut to these compounds that aren't supposed to get into your bloodstream?
Well, if we had one compound that definitely did it, Mike and I would be pretty rich at this point.
Sure.
yeah.
Well, some people talk about olive oils and things like that can help with the gut lining. And I just don't know in terms of you.
So I'll pitch a little bit of what we're working on in fermented foods. We don't know for a fact, but there's some metabolites that microbes produce, certainly within fermented foods that we are very interested in because they bind receptors on our cells. And one of those receptors is called the aryl hydrocarbon receptor. And we found that these metabolites can bind them and pretty high activity. And we know through other work that activating the aryl hydrocarbon receptor is one of the key promoters of barrier integrity. So something that can actually promote barrier function. We don't know. We don't have the definitive evidence yet. But if you put two pieces of the puzzle together and with other data, epidemiological data, and some intervention studies with fermented foods, I would argue that fermented foods, consuming them, more of them, is probably a good thing for barrier function. Now, that there needs to be a lot of pieces of the puzzle put together there, but that is certainly one. And then going back to the dietary fiber, I think there's some strong enough evidence there that consuming more fiber will promote barrier integrity rather than hinder it. So I think those...
Yeah, the short-chain fatty acid butyrate is very helpful for that.
Yes.
Butyrate.
Butyrate, okay. 100%. And that is a product of fiber fermentation.
Yeah. You can't eat it, but your gut bacteria will make it for you. I mean, you could eat it, but it tastes terrible.
It tastes terrible and smells terrible.
So what's sort of like the best source of that? What's the best source of, like, if you want your gut to make more butyrate?
Just more fermentable fiber.
Yeah.
Just more fermentable fiber.
Yeah.
Got it.
So this is going back to the original question. There's probably not one that's the best. The things like inulin, pectin, short-chain fructooligosaccharides, resistant starch. What else am I missing? There's a whole bunch and then there's also non-fermentable fibers, which are also good, but those will not produce the short-chain fatty acids that we're talking about.
Got it.
Cellulose.
Hemicellulose, yeah.
So those aren't fermentable, but they help you, move stuff along. So they provide bulking, and then they do other. I mean, so there's no one benefit to anything. These things have. That's why eating all the fibers is good.
Guys, where can we learn more about your work and maybe some websites or sources that you think might be useful for people who are interested more in these topics? Because there's a lot of BS out there.
I know. It's very, no, thanks for doing this podcast because I think as scientists, we need to do a better job of relaying what we find to the public. I think where scientists that get stuck is that we're too easy to admit that we don't know the answers to everything.
Yeah, sure.
And that's not necessarily what people want to hear, right? They want to say, give me this. I want to know exactly what to take to make this better. And if we had the answer for everything, we'd certainly tell you. But, for the probiotics, for example, there's not enough there to really give a definitive answer.
Although I do like the idea that, that is a very, something that just the idea that not all probiotics are the same. And if you're trying to get a specific effect, then, look it up. And you mentioned PubMed. These days, you don't even necessarily have to be a scientist to understand and use PubMed type. You go to, ChatGPT or Perplexity and have it go through PubMed and say, what are the benefits of this particular,
Yep.
what are the proven benefits based on the literature of this particular strain? So
Exactly.
yeah.
And as far as where to reach and get the best information for what we do, I'm currently have a website up in the works. I have somebody helping me do it because that's not my expertise.
Yeah, sure.
I'm a scientist, not a website designer, but I know Mike has a website that you could certainly go to.
Yeah.
And stuff.
I put in the chat, I put my favorite website for pre and probiotic stuff is ISAP, ISAPP. Yeah, they have a very good for clinicians, for people, for scientists, and a lot of great information there. And then from there you can sign. They'll have things about fermented foods too, and so you can find links to stories about and postbiotics as well. So all these other kind of topics that we talked about today. It's a great resource for more non-PubMed information. That's less technical.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Dr. Allen, Dr. Miller, thank you so much for spending all this time with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having us. That was fun.
That was fun. Yeah.
You're right back.